Welcome to Remainders. I'm your host, Darren Vorel.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick McIntyre.
We will explore the stories from our conscious collection of music, books, and film.
The ones that have shaped our lives.
Join us as we take a closer look at what remains.
Hey everyone, this is Remainders, where we talk about better living through the stories we know. We look at a piece from our own collection of books, music, and film, and we talk about it and how it's shaped us and who we became.
If you're just getting to know us, welcome. Pat and I have been friends for a very long time. We should probably talk a little bit before we get into what we're going to talk about today, about who we are and, just sort of how we met.
Yeah, man. We go back, don't we? It's pushing 20 years from the origins of suburban Chicago, slinging DVDs, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the way we came about this, is because we miss talking about movies and art and stuff like that, especially right now as this is being recorded. We're in a pandemic, and I think connecting to these type of things is even more important than it ever was, but especially with people who share your love of those types of things.
I get a lot out of the stories that come from those kind of DVD collections, those CD collections, those album collections, music and books. I kind of get a lot of life lessons out of them. I think a lot of people kind of share that same idea, but they don't always look at everything through a similar lens. And I'm certainly guilty of just consuming mindlessly, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but there's a lot of items that I've viewed and listened to and read in my life that has made me a better person, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what we're going to talk about today will actually expand on that a little bit, about empathy and where that comes from. And I think that is kind of what we wanted to do here. So earlier this year, Pat had introduced me to a lot of conscious living books, how things speak to you on a deeper level. And that's where we came up with this show, Remainders, to talk about what's really coming out of the art culture and things that we're consuming on a daily basis. What stays with us? That's the point of Remainders.
I think that really gets to it. Yeah, I kind of started creating. I've always been just a recommendations person. I've loved talking with people, turning people on to music, turning people on to books. And I think this year we've all had a little extra time on our hands. And so I just thought I'd like to reach out a little bit further. And if anybody is looking for book recommendations, I just thought, hey, maybe I can turn people on to something that's really spoken to me and made me laugh, made me kind of think deeper about how I live my life and largely how I can deal with struggles. I think a lot of people are sharing those same struggles this year. And for me personally, I've always kind of turned to books as a way of dealing with that.
For sure. And I think the first time that I ever had the inclination that like a movie had any kind of real meaning deeper than just entertainment was when I saw Vertigo in a film class. Up until seeing that movie, which is my favorite movie, Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo from '58, I really thought that it was all supposed to be just kind of make you laugh, comedy, go to the movies, it's fun and it's enjoyment. And of course that is part of it, as we just said. But it's also deeper. It's also got something to say. And even especially like a director like Hitchcock had a lot to say in that movie, even if it wasn't necessarily on brand for who Alfred Hitchcock was at the time. I really fell in love with movies at that point, and I really started to look at art, music, and entertainment a lot differently. I'm sure you've had a similar experience, but that was the great thing about working together at Suncoast all those years, is that we got to then be our own person outside of a classroom where we could talk about it with other people that had the same experiences. I hope we can do that for people in this podcast. When we explore something maybe they've not experienced, they might get interested in it, and it might open up a whole new world, things that can help them in their lives and maybe overcome some things that might be in their way personally.
I think that touches on a lot of what I personally like discussing all this with you for. And I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of it being personal. Because like all the things that we're going to be talking about are the items and the pieces and the music and the books that have spoken to us. And that doesn't mean that there's even better stuff out there that we have no idea about. That's just why we're kind of like opening up a conversation. This book may have done something for me, it may not have done something for you. Just having this discussion and being able to view all these things, how, watching a film, how can it make your life better?
100%. And I think that's a pretty good setup of us. Obviously, if people want to get to know us more, we'll have at the point of this airing, all the social things set up, and you can check those out. Maybe we'll add those in once we get them because we don't have them yet. This is the first episode, you guys, and we're excited about it. So why don't we talk a little bit about the structure of how these will go? We've decided to do seasons, and it's not going to be just about movies like we're going to talk about today. Roger Ebert's Life Itself, not the book form, but the film. And we're also going to give a little research about the art that we're consuming, and then kind of go into a discussion from there.
I really think we kind of chose Life Itself, the film specifically, for multiple reasons that we'll get into. Ebert being an important figure for us, kind of what the themes of the film are. And I think it really is going to set the tone for the remaining episodes in this season.
Well, there you go. Why don't we just get into it? So both of us grew up in the Windy City, and there's a lot to say about Chicago and the people within it. Everybody always looks at the Chicago Bulls. Everybody always looks at, Michael Jordan and never leaving the team. There's something really great about our Chicago heroes, let's say, and Roger Ebert is certainly one of those for us. Our first episode of the season, Life Itself from 2014, I think beautifully put by Chaz, Roger's wife. She said, people are interested in what you have to say, not in how you say it. So hopefully that's a good precursor to our discussion about this. This is a documentary about Chicago film critic Roger Ebert. And if you're of a certain age, you grew up during a time when you could turn on the television and see Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert discussing the movies. Everything from Benji to Goodfellas, it didn't really matter. It was whatever was kind of coming out in theaters. And they would speak as passionately about those movies as they would, a comedy or a drama or anything like that. It was really something for someone to turn on who was, before the age of social media, you could see two people bicker in person. And yet you always loved the fact that at the end of the show, they were going to come back next week and do it again. They weren't hating each other at the end of it. Maybe there was a little bit of that behind the scenes. I mean, how were we to know? But I did love that as a person who viewed those as a kid, watching them argue back and forth about the movies. The one thing that I think is good to note here is this movie was made by Steve James, who also made Hoop Dreams, which Roger Ebert really championed. I think it's so beautifully done that this last movie and sort of biography send-off for Roger, in a way, was done by Steve James. I felt that was how it got so personal and how so close.
James is definitely a big Chicago guy.
Hoop Dreams was about Chicago, right?
That's correct. Yeah, he also directed The Interrupters, which was only a couple years before Life Itself. It's his documentary about disrupting gang violence in Chicago through peer mediation. Very, very visceral documentary. Very interesting. I would definitely recommend that as well as anybody interested in checking out more of his films.
The kind of interesting connection between Hoop Dreams, where Roger Ebert at the time was very upset that it wasn't included in the Oscar nominations. You get this all those years later with Life Itself, which was also snubbed, as they say, at the Oscars. It was not even nominated in the category, which is an interesting twist of fate, I guess, for both of those movies. So that's sort of a little basis on the movie itself, and it's based on a book which I have not read. For me, I always was more the movie guy. Pat, is there big differences that you had seen in the movie, as opposed to reading Roger Ebert's? It's his memoir, yeah?
It is his memoir, and it is a very big difference between reading the book and watching the film. I read the book when it first came out, so it's been years now. So there aren't actual excerpts that stand out or anything, but it's just more detail into his personal life. But what separates the film is the integration of filming of his cancer treatment. So it bounces back and forth, and we'll get into it a little bit more, between his upbringing in Illinois and his work in Chicago, and then cutting back to the present in the 5 months when they were filming, where Roger currently is living with no jaw, basically facing death up front, and then living in this struggle while trying to still continue to work. So I think the film just really has that advantage of showing those intimate moments in a visual format. Some of these scenes are inexplicably graphic, and not in a bad way. They're just very intimate of what Roger went through, losing his bottom jaw through cancer.
Yeah, that's very well said. And like you mentioned, we'll go through a few of those things and how they pertain to this podcast. You know, I think the reception at the time and coming off the heels of him passing away was, for me personally, so beautiful to see the city of Chicago celebrate this man this way, especially, too, the way it ends with him being able to see that his life's work is going to be put onto this new platform of his website for it to live on. I mean, when you think about yourself as an artist and all the work that you do, you really don't know what's going to happen to it after you're gone from here. And you really, to think about it isn't really the point. It's just to do it because you have to. You love it, and you have something to say or something you want to talk about, you know, in the moment. Part of conscious living is living in the moment, right? Not in the past or not in the future. And so to be able to see what you had done and the life that it will have after you're gone is something most artists don't get to celebrate while they're alive.
I'm just curious. So we're both from Chicago, reading and listening to specifically Roger Ebert, but then also Siskel and Ebert on the show. Did you watch the show more, or did you read his reviews as much?
You know, it's interesting. I watched the show more. It's almost worth watching for someone to get an idea of what Chicago's like, you know, because it exuded Chicago.
It was absolutely that.
Which is something else, I guess, that we gravitated towards, you know, as we're talking, both people that are born and raised here in Chicago. Obviously, you're not in Chicago right now, but I guarantee you miss things like that. Those are things that'll never leave you no matter where you go.
For the listeners, I'm currently in Columbus, Ohio. I am a lifelong Chicago resident, though, so I am currently missing out on the beautiful city of Chicago.
Yeah, and as we're recording this, it's fall, so it has been pretty beautiful. No, not rubbing it in, Pat. Okay.
Hey, I got this Ohio foliage over here.
Well, so. I guess that's true, you know. And hey, I'll never know if I don't ever go, right? To answer your question, I did watch the show more. And as he became more of a blogger in his later years, which the movie does talk about, I did read a lot more because he had become so ingrained with Twitter and things like that. Plus, you'd love hearing things that from time to time at chirping up about him, you know, taking digs at Vincent Gallo, you know, with the doubt. The Brown Bunny stuff. I mean, he was just so good at that stuff. And it was like, man, if you want to get smashed, go to like, do anything to kind of get in Roger Ebert's way, you know?
Well, yeah, like in his blogging, he really, which I unfortunately haven't read a whole lot of in his later years, but he really branched out from film, you know, when he was kind of in a position where all he could do was write, and he wasn't able to do the show, or just not as much. He really branched out on subjects, and he wrote about politics and society. That really kind of goes back to the roots, as we see him in the opening of the film, his roots in Urbana, Illinois, working at the newspaper covering the civil rights era. The
idea of being a writer first, he kind of talks about this in the movie, that, you know, becoming a critic was just a job opening that happened. They needed a spot to fill, and they placed him there at the Chicago Sun-Times. I thought that was crazy. I mean, I love that story. He's like, I could always write, I just could. That's his own quote on just like what attracted him to writing. And after graduating from the University of Chicago, or while he was probably still there, he was just looking for a job. And he applies at the Sun-Times, and they just place him in the film critic section.
I'm sure he loved film, obviously, but it's not like he was applying specifically for that job.
They touch on his upbringing, and I was interested in that because I think that goes with who he became. It seemed like he was very supported by his parents, and that they sort of like, they talked about being at the breakfast table, and then they would read something by him and like actually applaud. Like, that seemed so shocking to me that he would have parents that were that supportive. And also his father, I believe, was more of a Democrat, and his mother, he talked about having more of the empathy. And that brings me to what my first takeaway is. There's that quote about that movies are like a machine that generates empathy, and as
right.
The spirit of our show here, I think that gets right at the core of this and why we're talking about this. Because to be a critic of the movies, talking about empathy and the ability to love and have compassion in this life, we need to connect and travel there through the art that we experience, no matter what it is, as we talked about before, movies, books, any kind of artistic medium. And that connects people, and that generates empathy, and that gets you to also, he championed a lot of things that you would not necessarily be exposed to, almost like similar to what Anthony Bourdain did in his life. Would take you to places and expose things that you didn't have much understanding of. And that's easy to be prejudiced about things that you don't have understanding about if you're not given that in some sort of format. I think Roger Ebert did that.
I think that's an absolute great point. And I totally 100% agree with you that it's one of the main things that I took away from it is his emphasis on empathy. That quote is a wonderful one. I'm just going to read it if that's all right. The purpose of civilization and growth is to reach out and empathize a little bit with other people. And for me, the movies are like a machine that generate empathy. It lets you understand a little bit more about different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears. It helps us to identify with people who are sharing this journey with us in life. I think that's an amazing framework for his life and kind of just what this movie represents in terms of getting that empathy out of art.
The documentary starts off with that right away, so you really understand what this man was all about, what you're getting into.
And you know what I love right after that? Is how much everybody called him an asshole.
Yeah, totally. Great filmmaking in that.
It's just another aspect of how great this movie is. It just really gets into who he was. And, he was not a mean-spirited asshole, but he was passionate about what he thought about films and what he thought about his own life and how to live it. And he was much more abrasive than that quote kind of may suggest, even though I'm sure it's 100% applicable to what he... on how he lived his life.
The way to tell the story and the dedication to what's right for the reader, it's sort of what you're talking about. The reason maybe he was such an asshole, at least what I had understood, is that you really need to get your point across in an eloquent way, but also sometimes a little forcefully to get people to understand what you're trying to say. And I just thought that they talked about, the ad in the Kennedy assassination paper and pointing out that the musket was in the ad was pointed at him at the hour when the prints are rolling. And this is a story. This is a gigantic story in the nation's history. You can't stop the presses on that. Yet he did, because he thought it was in poor taste to have that musket in the ad point at the president. And I just thought that said it all right there. Why he would be successful right from the beginning is because you fought for those things, no matter how disruptive it was going to be to some process. You knew that the reader might catch that, and in their mind thought about the tragedy that happened more so than the beautiful life of this president that everybody, most people, let's say, loved and adored at the time of 1963.
Yeah, and that's him when he was 21, 22 years old, running the student newspaper of a giant university, so it's obviously not a small newspaper or anything, and he's just in this position of power. And even if he wasn't in the position of power, he was displaying the power. 100%.
And again, I got to say that to be successful, you have to do those kind of things. And again, would that make him popular at the newspaper? Hell no. Especially not as a snot-nosed kid at that age. And you're trying to, stop the presses when that's money, that's time, that's people. Can you imagine people having to stay all night to print that stuff? So I thought that was like a nice point at the beginning to show where he was headed.
And also it just kind of resonates through. He's not going to be a nice guy with everybody when he's watching these films that he may or may not love. He gets into how much he loves Scorsese, but then when Scorsese made a bomb, he was not afraid of saying, hey, Marty, your movie sucks. But he did it eloquently. He did it with, as Marty points out in the movie, he did it with respect.
Right, and you can see how far that goes when you're not just the yes man or the yes woman. When you're having discussions with people, when you actually have some back and forth and debate about things, that makes you a better human being, really. And you can see that in Scorsese's face. I don't think I've ever seen an interview with Martin Scorsese where he gets choked up like he did in this. Roger Ebert meant something pretty special to Martin Scorsese. One of the things that I think you need to be one of these Chicago types that everybody loves, you need to be a little bit of a scoundrel. And so kind of talking about how he's an asshole and those things, and then going into the segue of him in the bar life. And I think that's something you and I can definitely relate to, especially how much we love places like seedy bars, those places you go to in Chicago that are just, you can smoke in them still, like, you know, how? I don't know. But, like, it's Chicago, and you don't question it. And those kind of places are the places, you know, you can imagine Roger Ebert going back in his days of drinking. And he carried a lot of troubles with alcoholism, yet he told really nobody for 30 years. I think that contributes to the whole mythos of the Chicago character and why Roger Ebert, that part of his story, I think, is important. The crew that he kind of was around, they mentioned a lot about telling stories and how he would command the crowd, whether you wanted to hear it or not. And also some of the choices he had with women at the time, you know. And it goes to show that connects with everybody. Oh, Roger Ebert was one of us. He could go to these bars. He could hang at the bar with us till all nights, you know.
Yeah, no doubt. So after his inauguration with Sun-Times and becoming the film critic, they really do a hard cut straight into Old Town Ale House and O'Rourke's. So O'Rourke's was a former bar that we are obviously too young to have never been to, but many of the interviews are set in the Old Town Ale House, which I'm assuming you've been?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So me too, multiple times. If you're in Chicago, if you've been to Chicago, you may be familiar with it, but it's this fantastic dive bar on North Avenue. Very unique place, been around for years, and they really... in the film, they really emphasize all those things you were saying, just how much he was a staple in that place and kind of, in doing so, becoming that true Chicago. His quote was basically, I drank there almost every night when I was in town over the years. And so when John McHugh he was another Chicago writer, when he's talking about Ebert in this bar, he's mentioning other Chicago writers like Saul Bellow, Studs Terkel, Nelson Algreen, and he's just pointing out how all of them are not from Chicago, whereas Ebert is somebody who was born and raised in Chicago and who was able to really craft that voice, and in his stubbornness really kind of wanted to make that his own. And in doing so, it shows, as you mentioned, on his drinking problem. I can only admire so much how upfront he became with it once he realized he had a problem. Yeah,
and I think just to touch back on, I would have never known Studs Terkel was not from Chicago, you know? But when you say that, when you find that out, it does kind of diminish the rep just a little bit. It's like... Yeah, it's not to take anything away. I mean, the dude's an amazing... No, right? Yeah, Studs is amazing. He's a staple, but it just really... It is just a fact. He just wasn't originally from Chicago. So he's still... It was an outsider coming in writing about Chicago. That doesn't change anything. It just... All it does is probably just bolstered Ebert and his... Maybe a little bit of his Chicago ego, I would say. One other thing I wanted to say is, like, it really gets into that drinking thing, too, because if you live and work in the Loop, or you live around here, I currently live in, I guess it would be called the West Loop, but I walk
You are
around
in the
at
West
5
Loop,
o'clock.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, whatever, you know. I hate these names of the towns around here. I'm just like,
you sounded reticent.
I live in Chicago.
Yeah, there you go. That works.
Yeah, but... Like, you know, the fun thing is to kind of, after work is off at 5 o'clock, which is why it's so shocking in a big city like Chicago during a pandemic. Everybody goes out, and it doesn't need to be Friday after 5 o'clock. You stumble out of these big-ass buildings, big-ass skyscrapers, and you find your local bar closest to your office, and you take, you know, by 12 o'clock at night, you're taking the bus home. to do it all over the next day. I mean, it's the release of the people in Chicago.
Right.
And so I could really, really connect to him going out to these bars.
Oh my God. I mean, the scenes between the blues music, all the pictures showing of him back in the day at O'Rourke's and Old Town Ale House, it was an absolute romanticized version, a picturesque version of drinking in Chicago, working and drinking in Chicago.
Which is why it's so hard to stop, right?
No, absolutely. And, I've talked to you plenty about this. I'm coming up, personally, on 1 year of sobriety. So I've made a conscious effort and a decision to step away from alcohol. Many different reasons. Watching those scenes, it really touches on one reason why it is so difficult for so many other people to step away from alcohol. It's because of the romanticized ideal of drinking on a regular basis, especially in a beautiful city like Chicago.
That's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast, is because I think you've helped me with a lot of things with drinking. I wouldn't necessarily say that I want to stop drinking forever. That wasn't why I did it, but I definitely saw the benefits of slowing down or even stopping, which I have. I haven't had a drink in 9 months now.
Right. That's awesome.
I've had a beer baby at this point.
I congratulate on that. And yeah, you touch on a really important part. There's a notion that stepping away from alcohol has to be all or nothing. And I personally completely disagree with that. It sounds like there are many shades, there are moderations. It's different for everybody. And that's something we'd like to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think that you touched on it so well with the idea of, all of this, the Chicago mentality is like, you don't complain. It's Midwest, really.
Right.
You don't complain. You do your job. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, as your parents probably mistakenly have instilled in you over the years. And you feel like you just need that release. You need your friends around. You need to get crazy and let loose. And that's all part of it. And after you stop drinking for a while, I don't know if you necessarily reminisce or miss and want to go out and drink when you see stuff like this in life itself, but it definitely is a reminder of what fun those nights were. Even if the hangover felt the worst it ever could be, you still kind of romanticize it. I guess that's F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's all of those, Stephen King, all of the writers who became big alcoholics. It's romanticized.
It was especially difficult for me to watch in this right now. One of the last things I was able to do before the pandemic was to actually go to the Steppenwolf Theater. I saw a production of Bug from Tracy Letts, which was great. Afterwards, I had a non-alcoholic drink at the Old Town Ale House because it's right around the corner from there. So that was one of the last nights out before everything shut down in February, I think it was. So
that's kind of a beautiful memory, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it's great. But at the same time, it's like you're seeing all this fun that was going on at the place, and it was definitely it set off a lot of good memories for me at the same time. So
yeah,
a little more about the ale house. I just love how much for anybody who's never been there, it's a very unique place with many unique pictures, hand drawn from the artist there. They do John Candy. There's Michael Shannon. A lot of Chicago figures. Obviously, it shows Ebert's picture. And it kind of sets the tone for that place. And I love that they showed that Michael Shannon picture. One, for all the people who remember maybe seeing Michael Shannon drinking at a bar on the night that he was nominated for the Oscar for Shape of Water. I don't know if you remember seeing this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was there. Yep.
So that was the Old Town Ale House. That was him directing a play at the Steppenwolf, I believe. While the Oscars were going on, he couldn't make the Oscars, so this picture of him sitting in a bar watching his own Oscar nomination, and it goes viral. And that's the Old Town Ale House right there. That shows another staple of Chicago. That
was totally Chicago, and that's why I loved it. Because it was kind of like, well, I'm working, and I'm at a bar. Right. Great. So let's move on from that, because I think we've talked a lot about that subject.
Yeah, no, I do want to point out one thing. So we've mentioned how the romanticism of that scene, of him drinking, having amazing times, working and living in Chicago, and then the film itself cuts directly to him.
But this is exactly what I wanted to say. The segue was so crazy sobering is the word.
Yes. So it's this beautiful representation of his early days working and drinking, and then it cuts right to, I believe, his producer, talking about how he confessed to her that he would come home from her work some nights and wish he was dead. He was obviously going through deep, deep depression while drinking extensively. He later writes this, quote, "I found it almost impossible to stop after I started after one or two. I paid a price in hangovers. But without hangovers, it is possible that I'd still be drinking. I would also be unemployed, unmarried, and probably dead." He went through deep depression, and the movie really captures this. And I think the juxtaposition of showing how lovely of a time he looked like he was having, how much fun of a time he was having, cut right to what he was actually feeling.
Yeah, and so my segue actually was a little deeper still than that, but that was wonderfully said. And I was more so talking about the present day cutback to...
Okay, the hard cut back to him. Yes.
I also think that those moments, as long as you survive them, let's say, are important parts of growing in parts of your life.
Okay.
Because when you cut back to President's Day of him needing to drink, he talks about, again, I say it's the most sobering moment of the film. It's like you don't know what's going to happen to you in this life. So you do have to live a little, and you have to enjoy yourself, but not excessively. And that's the point, right? Moderation and everything. Because here he is in present day and he's drinking from this tube that they're giving him. And he kind of makes a joke like, I don't think I'm going to be an alcoholic anymore unless I fill up one of my bags with it. He always had the greatest spirit during those things. Those moments were still important, even if they were very hard moments in his life and depressing, as you just said, because he still knows that he was able to go out and do those kind of things and see that it wasn't for him. Sometimes you have to experience those things. When we read our books about being conscious about drinking, a lot of people talk about why can some people have one or two and that's it, Well, we're different. All of us are different people and experiences are different for all of us. I think that's really when they hit that moment where he's drinking out of the tube, it's like he didn't know he was going to get cancer, but he lived a very full life, I would think. He would agree.
Yeah, and he would be the first one to point out that when he stopped drinking in 1979, that was a reason why he was able to live such a long life, was that sobriety.
If we put a bow on this whole conversation of the drinking for you and I, all I really had to do is kind of see how much my life would get better by not doing it, because it had been so long since I hadn't gone out and thought I have to have a drink or this, that, or the other thing. Everybody's doing it. I'm at a bar. Why not? I'll have one. Turns into 5. Turns into tomorrow morning. I don't remember what I did. The main thing about that for me is that now that I don't have those hangovers, the amount of time that I have to create art that I love to do is not diminished in any way. Anytime that I had to be depressed, I'm not incapacitated to think about that because I'm working on the things I love. And he talks about that later in the film. How do you keep going? And it's like, well, I just work hard. And people think, oh, that's crazy that you would work so hard when you're so sick and all that stuff. But it is the process. You as a writer, Pat, or me as an artist, painting or making music, I don't think about being depressed, not 1 second when I'm in that work. And that's a super important takeaway of this film. When you're working at something that you love, I'm not quoting him verbatim, but when you work at something that you love, everything else kind of fades away into the background.
I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, he really does emphasizes how he zeroes in on his work and gets in the zone while he's struggling with this third act in his life.
And then there's the quote, "You couldn't mate Siskel and Ebert if you were Dr. Frankenstein," which I love. It really gets at maybe what you didn't see on screen. Obviously, you saw a lot of that, but maybe there was even crazier behind the scenes. And
right.
But again, I think that's what brought the audience in. These two passionate guys not giving in. I mean, it was like, I'm going to prove to you why you're wrong and you're an asshole the whole time. Who doesn't love to watch two experts in their field debate like that? I mean, the presidential debate that just happened, as much as it was a train wreck, I guarantee people could not look away. And the love and the respect, this is the difference of, I think, what we saw in the presidential debate that just came up. The love and respect for someone who disagrees with you is at the root of that show for me. Again, like I said at the beginning, you still tuned in every week and you still saw them arguing.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, I love how much they cover their relationship and their friendship and the turmoil that it goes through. So yeah, so after this phase, it cuts to the early stages of the show. So they cut to the introduction of Siskel into Ebert's life, basically. So they were working, Ebert's at the Sun-Times, Siskel's at the Chicago Tribune, and for 5 years, those film critics, and they had never really spoken to each other that much. Obviously, they were around each other, they knew each other, they just didn't like each other for the first 5 years that they knew each other. And I think that really sets an interesting dynamic for their intimate friendship, which was genuine, I think. A killer mustache on Siskel in that early show. That handlebar mustache is a thing of beauty.
I love how his wife was like, yeah, you got to get rid of that thing.
She was pretty adamant about that. And those early scenes, oh man, okay, so we skipped over the fact that for whatever reason, Ebert wrote Beyond the Valley of the Dolls with Russ Meyer.
Yeah.
It's a one-off in Ebert's career, but for whatever reason, because he loved women, he just ended up writing this Meyer, and his wife, or Siskel's wife, really hits the nail on the head, whereas when Ebert wrote about Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Siskel actually lived it.
Right.
Being so close with Hugh in the Playboy Mansion.
Some other things to talk about. Obviously, we're talking about two critics that, even if you didn't live during the time that they were living and working, you've still heard of Two Thumbs Up. You still know that they were responsible for a lot of people understanding what a critic was. And before that, though, there were a lot of critics. And I just love, this is my favorite line in the movie. I'm going to say that I've had a lot of fun thinking about how blatant this quote is, and I know you know what I'm going to talk about. And I felt, in my mind, that she must have been some sort of monster for someone to say this about her. But I think it really comes from the place that it's like Ebert's friend, who's kind of like, yeah, well, there's really nobody but Siskel and Ebert. However, you and I went to the Siskel Center just last year, right? Or was it this year? That
was this year, dude.
That was this year.
Isn't that what's crazy about this year so far?
Yeah, before the pandemic.
That was within 10 months ago, yeah.
Well, you and I went to the Siskel Center and actually saw the Pauline Kael documentary, which is the quote I'm about to say.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was beautifully done, and it got me to understand Pauline Kael in a different way. And I didn't really realize it or pay attention because, honestly, this line is so stunning when it comes up and memorable that that's really all you think about. And you don't even pay attention to, in now rewatching Life Itself, they do give a nod to how much Roger Ebert respected her. And look at how many books he owned of hers,
No doubt.
But the line is, I don't know Pauline Kael, I never knew Pauline Kael, but fuck Pauline Kael.
Yeah, you really emphasize the fuck on that one because Rick Cogan really gets into it. So that's Rick Cogan, Chicago writer, defending his friend Ebert from the perception that Pauline Kael was high art film criticism, dwarfing Roger Ebert and Siskel's low art film criticism. That's essentially the dynamic.
Well said. And by the way, even putting it into that, I forget the other critic who talked about it, but saying that this was either it's good or it's bad, and there's no in between. And that, I think that was a misconception. But then Ebert's rebuttal was, hey, yeah, of course it's going to look like that because we're making a TV show. We've got a half an hour to tell our story.
No doubt. He was as they mentioned later, he was a populist. He wanted everybody to be able to appreciate things, and I think that's one of the things why he reviewed films, is he felt everybody was able to appreciate what films had to offer. I love the Pauline Kael showing the books, showing her thought-out criticisms, and then they hard cut to Dog of the Week with Siskel and Ebert. They got this little dog. Hey, this is the crappy movie of the week, Dog of the Week, and it was such a great. And then they show the late night performances. It really shows how big they were at the time, which is kind of crazy to think about. Just that these two film critics, as you said, kind of odd looking. Frankenstein couldn't make them. That they were this popular.
This is important, I think, to this as well. I think this was their producer who was saying this. The line: the movie studios went from helping us to hating us to fearing us. Big fucking statement on your climb to success.
No doubt.
I feel like as the underdog, there's a lot of people that want to help you. I mean, there's your detractors too, but I would say in large part there's a lot more people that want to help the underdog because in the back of their mind, they don't really think anything's going to happen to you. But then when you start to have a little bit of success, and this is, again, for our listeners, they're talking about it in regards to the stamp of approval that they would have on movies. And that was a lot of sway with the audience, whether they'd go see it, which obviously meant money to the studios. So probably in the beginning, they wanted to help them because they thought, hey, if we help these guys, they're going to give us a good review on our movie, which will help sway it. Then they went to hating them because they realized these guys weren't going to play ball. Meaning Siskel and Ebert aren't going to play ball, and they're going to give it to the audience straight, which we love them for, then to fearing us because, holy shit, now these guys are so successful. They're in New York markets, they're in Los Angeles markets, not just Chicago, and the sway they have is definite. Every movie poster you would see would say either 2 thumbs up. I mean, they wouldn't put 2 thumbs down on it unless somebody was really trying to put it out that they hated it, but it was always 2 thumbs up. And if you saw that, you're like, it must be good.
No, it made me remember on how easy it is to forget, but how big the idea of 2 thumbs up was throughout the 80s and the 90s, and how much that influenced so many movies getting seen and whether or not they were successful at the theaters. Because you saw like a couple of the posters where it just shows 2 thumbs up, or even just hearing that. It's nothing you really hear anymore. Now that you hear like Rotten Tomatoes, for example. For like 2 decades there, it was like whether or not Siskel and Ebert liked it often dictated how much your film was going to be seen.
Yep, and I think that's really important to say that. But again, they went from helping us to hating us to fearing us, I think is just a big statement just in terms of any artist out there. Can we talk quickly about the story with Ava DuVernay? What a beautiful way to talk about art. And about they talk in the movie that Ava DuVernay goes to the Oscars with her aunt and had a chance, probably no more than 5-minute talk with Roger Ebert when she was a child. And it inspired her to be a filmmaker, that meeting. And so then she makes a documentary, I think it is, about her aunt. I have not seen it, I have to say. Maybe you have, Pat, but that she had passed away, her aunt had passed away from cancer, and the movie was about that. And Roger saw the movie, wrote about it, unbeknownst to him that she had this chance encounter with him when she was a little girl that inspired her. And so in 2011, he got an email from her, and she said, I just wanted to say that we had a meeting. Here's a picture of us. And he wrote a blog about it. And to me, that's truly the heart of what art does. It's reciprocal. And it can continue to inspire us for all of our years on Earth. Because at that point, Ebert had no clue. He just, inspired somebody by what he did, by her seeing him and maybe shaking his hand and getting a picture. It inspired her to make this art. Years later, it inspired him to write a blog about it and to, review her work. And I just think, God, wow, what a great, beautiful artistic circle that is.
Yeah, I think they put that perfectly.
But I wanted to ask you about the Caldwell Lily Pool. And for people out there who do not know, I didn't know about the Alfred Caldwell Lily Pool in Chicago, and it is basically connected to the Lincoln Park Zoo. It's not exactly, but you can access it pretty quickly from being in that area of Lincoln Park in the city of Chicago. That was asked as a question of what is one of your favorite places in the city. Speaking of Chicago, there's a siren in the background.
That's the West Loop right there.
I'll let that pass. So, yeah, I would say that scene where he asked that question, the filmmaker, and Roger talks about the Caldwell Lily Pool, that's the reason that I visited there for my first time.
When was that?
When this movie came out. So 2015.
Oh, okay.
And that's right when I moved to the spot that I'm at right now. And it was like an oasis in the middle of the bustling city, and you could see why he loved it. And even there's a Anthony Bourdain episode of Chicago where he does go to Old Town Ale House, and he does go with the guy who owns the ale house, who's the artist there, who also takes Bourdain to the seat where him and Roger Ebert used to always sit, and where Roger Ebert used to sit and reflect. And when you walk into the Lily Pool, it really is like you're in the Garden of Eden. It's so beautiful, especially in the fall. like right now. A lot of people go in there to take photos for weddings, but I think it's largely unknown, to most people, and it's magical. I just wanted to ask if you had ever been there.
I have been there. I love the area. It is relatively unknown. You are right about that. It's not always like empty or anything, but it isn't like some major tourist attraction. It is kind of like this unique little spot on the north side, a little separated away from Lake Michigan, kind of tucked away in Lincoln Park. And it is appropriately beautiful as they show it and as Ebert describes it.
Yeah, and I just thought of a working artist in this big city that can be pretty daunting at times, can be pretty depressing, can be pretty hard on you. I just love thinking of him taking that time for himself and that getaway, to really collect his thoughts. And I think as I get older and I work harder at the things that I love, I seek that more. I mean, Ebert talked a lot more about that with nature. And once he met Chaz, which is a big part of this story as well, his wife, and sort of adopting her kids and taking family trips. I mean, how great did those look? And like him going on the walks with them, and you just kind of love that for him, that he had that part of his life to be loved the way he was.
It's essential to have those little spaces especially in a big city in Chicago, where you could just go and be by yourself and quote the Great Gatsby and get inspired.
Yeah, and so I talked earlier about getting to the end of the Leave of Presence, of course, which was his last blog entry, the title of, in the movie, sadly passes away. But the way Chaz tells that story was so beautiful, and you almost feel like you could have been in that room by the way she talked about it.
I mean, watching Chaz go through this, Roger can't talk. He's only speaking through his MacBook, but all the emotion and sadness is really coming through Chaz, which just kind of makes it interesting in Ebert's relationship with death. He was always very upfront about not having fears of death, which is what made him comfortable with the act of dying, which I think is a huge part of why this film was so powerful.
It was kind of hard to watch, as there were some questions that the director was putting through as his last days were approaching. It was harder and harder for him to answer, and time had just run out. But it was almost so poignant to the film to kind of have that whole thing. There was a exhibit at the Art Institute about Ivan Albright's, I guess you'd call them selfies nowadays, but self-portraits that he would do. And he did them.
Yeah, those are great.
You've seen them.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
Every once in a while, the Art Institute unearths them, and they're in some special exhibition, and I cannot get enough of them.
No, so good.
But if you look at the last 2 years, and especially the last one that he did of his self-portrait, it's almost rudimentary, like a child had done it with crayon, And this amazing artist who was able to get into the deep crevices and explore your life and your faults and all these things in your face. At the end, you're just sort of, you diminish and you wither away, and it's beautiful in a way, because the way she talks about the way he died, and I've heard this before about people talking about death, that, all that stuff that you carry around all day long, and that's why you hunch over gradually over time, and it's just so heavy. The life is just so heavy. When you die, all of that goes away, and it's like completely exhilarating feeling to be free of all of it. And it seems the way that she explains that about Roger, not to say he was plagued by these things that you carry around all the time, but you just do. Like the experiences with alcoholism, those are things you just carry around. You just can't help it. That's part of your story.
Not to disagree with you at all. I think it's just a perception. It's like, I don't think he was bogged down by a lot of those things. And I think that has a lot to do with, and they mention it in his Catholicism and upbringing and its emphasis on death. And I mean, and any philosophy worth its salt has a strong emphasis on death and its incorporation into daily living and being conscious of your life being finite. And it's for that exact reason. It's instead of waiting to the end of your life to let go of all those things, you let go of them in the moment.
I had really thought of it a little differently as I watched it, but now I'm thinking about it differently. And I think that's the point of good discussion, is kind of like, there's another side to this that I didn't really explore, in my first watch there.
I mean, what do you think? Like, I'm watching him have these amazing in these last 5 months of his life, when he's in his wheelchair, he's in the hospital, he doesn't have a jaw, he can't speak, he's only talking through MacBook. His clear joy in life was still coming through. He still had that happy personality, and I was just like, I was in awe of it. I'm like, there are days when I'm like annoyed at trivial things over and over, and they bog me down on a daily basis sometimes. Whereas this man is going through his fifth surgery for jaw cancer. He's clearly, as he's stated many times, on the last act of his life. He's well aware that he's going to die soon, and yet he still has this joy. Like, for example, like when he's showing the Up series to his step grandchildren. He's talking about these movies that he loves and just exposing. He's still doing the same thing he's been doing his whole life, and he's doing it with joy while he's facing death up front.
I don't think I could have been as strong with that. But again, I guess maybe I don't know because I haven't lived a full life yet where I've been able to let go of those things. I feel like I'm still, that's part of our friendship between you and I that has helped. I have been able to let go of a lot by the people that I surround myself with here in my middle life. I feel like I only surround myself with people that are helping me these days, and I help them back. It's reciprocal instead of the people that used to be in your younger years, they would kind of grab at anything they could take from you. I'm just not interested in that because as you get older, you realize that you want to have some good living left, surrounding yourself with people that clearly have your best intentions at heart. It's so easy to give back to those people because you know that they genuinely care about you. There's a lot of that in this, with even the way they talk about Gene Siskel and him passing away and the difference between him, the way he chose to go and when he passed away, and the difference between Roger and even what Roger learned from Gene that he wanted everyone to know. He wanted the cameras rolling to know the full story of what was happening to him when Gene decided to be very much more private about it, which you don't know which is right when you hear those. It's what's right for you as a person, right? Because Gene's wife says that his kids were able to not look at it at the clock all the time. They got to enjoy the time with their father. I don't know Gene's kids. I don't know how they felt about it. But that was a choice that he made, and that was his to make.
Yeah, that was a pretty impactful part when they're showing Chaz suggesting that Ebert was pretty hurt when Siskel didn't tell him about his own cancer. And then they kind of really cut to that Esquire photo after his jaw removal, which is such like this intimate picture, just straight up front after one of the later surgeries where his entire jaw is gone. The camera's right in his face, and it's the most intimate picture you could see about this person going through this potentially traumatic event, and yet he's still putting himself out there because that's who he is.
Even in death, the two men couldn't have been more united, but yet more apart, in the way they chose to live their lives.
It's a great way to put it. I love it.
Well, I really love, I got to just say it as a general statement, I have watched this movie probably 5 times in my life here. I enjoyed this process of getting to talk about it because, one, I like talking about movies with you, but 2, I got to really look at the movie more in depth than I did on the first 4 viewings that I had because I really wanted to pull things out. And I think that's an exercise that a lot of people should take away is that really, what our podcast is about is explore the things that are left behind with you and really ask questions. Why is that still with you? How is that going to help you in your daily life? Our podcast is called Remainders for a reason. Every single thing that you consume in your life, I would venture to say even stuff in social media, sometimes in a negative way, will stay with you, and you get to choose which moments do.
You can live your life, you can read, listen, watch, scroll, but if you do those things consciously, I think you have the potential to live a really good life.
Yeah, exactly, and conscious living is something I've learned has helped me greatly, and going into something and understanding what you're getting into so that you can make great decisions about what you take away.
Yeah, and we get to do that through these amazing films and books and music that hopefully we'll be talking about later.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. This first inaugural episode on Life Itself. We have a lot more exciting stuff to come up, but we do thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us on our next episode. You have been listening to Remainders. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by Darren Vorel and Patrick McIntyre. Original music, episode art, logo, and editing by Darren Vorel. Find out what else remains by visiting our website at remainderspod.com. And we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search @RemainersPod. Please tell anyone you can about our show, and we look forward to telling you more of what remains next time.